Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's been buzzing, well, pretty much everywhere you look and hear about the workplace lately. Quiet quitting.
Yeah, it's really captured the global conversation, hasn't it? It feels like it's given a name, a label to something a lot of people might have been feeling or, doing for a while without really calling it anything specific.
Absolutely. And to help us really understand what's going on, we've got a pretty interesting set of sources today. There's a really detailed academic study focusing specifically on Gen Z employees in China. It uses, proper data and theory to model why they might be quietly quitting.
Which is great for getting into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. And alongside that, we've got a couple of articles that give us the broader picture, context on the phenomenon itself and how this generation, Gen Z, seems to be approaching work more generally across different places.
It's a really powerful mix, actually. The academic paper is like putting the topic under a microscope. It gives us that deep, data-driven insight into the why behind Gen Z's behavior, especially in a specific context like China, which has its own pressures, right?
Right.
And then the other articles help us kind of zoom out, see how it fits into the bigger global trends and the conversation we're all having.
Precisely. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We want to get past the buzzwords and really unpack what quiet quitting actually means. We want to explore the specific things driving it for younger workers, especially looking at that China research, and then think about, what does this signal for the future, for work expectations? Not just for Gen Z, but maybe for all of us.
Yeah, it's about digging down to the roots, isn't it? Not just looking at the leaves. We need to understand the underlying dynamics, the experiences shaping this whole thing.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with the basics. What is quiet quitting, really? Because the term itself just seemed to appear out of nowhere and boom, it was everywhere.
It really did explode, didn't it? The term itself got huge traction last year, and a lot of that was down to Zaid Khan and his TikTok video. His explanation was just so simple and relatable. I think that's why it hit home for so many.
What was his take again?
He basically defined it as not outright quitting your job, but quitting the idea of going above and beyond.
Which is so clear, isn't it? It immediately separates it from, actually handing in your notice and leaving.
Exactly. And the academic study we're looking at, it gives a more formal definition, but it lines up perfectly with that viral one. It describes quiet quitting as employees showing limited commitment. They stick strictly to their minimum requirements, what's in the job description. They seem disengaged, they lack initiative, they're reluctant to take on extra tasks, anything beyond the absolute bare minimum.
So it's a kind of gradual pulling back.
Yes, a gradual, often subtle disengagement. And crucially, it happens without formally saying you're leaving or starting any kind of resignation process. You're still there, physically, showing up, getting paid, but you've kind of mentally and emotionally checked out from anything beyond what's strictly required.
So it's really about setting boundaries then, maybe quite firm boundaries around your effort and what you're willing to do.
You could definitely frame it that way. And that's where you see this stark contrast with what was, for a long time, the prevailing norm, right? This idea of hustle culture.
Oh, yeah, that dominated for years.
It really did. This pervasive idea that you had to give 110%, volunteer for everything, work late, work weekends, always go above and beyond your job description. That was supposed to be how you showed ambition, proved your worth, climbed the ladder. And in a lot of places, that expectation of going above and beyond stopped being exceptional and just became, well, the expected standard.
And quiet quitting feels like a pushback against that, a silent rebellion almost.
It really does. It's employees saying, hold on, my job shouldn't consume my entire life, my energy, my mental space. Or maybe I shouldn't have to constantly perform way beyond what I'm actually paid or contracted to do.
Which, again, is different from actually quitting. That involves a clear decision, notice periods, talking to your boss.
Right, the whole formal process.
Yeah.
Actual quitting is overt. There's an expressed intent to leave, handover, offboarding, all that stuff. Quiet quitting is staying put, keeping the job, but fundamentally changing how engaged you are, how much discretionary effort you're willing to put in while you're there.
Yeah, the key is withdrawing commitment while staying.
Exactly. That's the core distinction.
It's funny how the term got so popular so fast, but one of the sources mentioned the actual idea isn't totally new.
That's a really important point. The academic paper notes that while quiet quitting feels very current, very 2020s, the underlying behavior employees disengaging or just doing the minimum has probably been around forever, right?
Makes sense.
They even mentioned the term itself might have popped up way back in 2009, possibly from an economist named Mark Bolger. So the behavior isn't new, but the visibility, the huge discussion around it now, the catchy name that's definitely tied to social media and these big shifts we've seen post-pandemic.
And speaking of different contexts, one article mentioned a parallel movement in China.
Yes, the Balin movement. It translates roughly as lying flat or maybe more dramatically, letting it rot. The source describes it as this quite sophisticated Chinese youth movement. It's a form of quiet resistance against what they see as a super arduous, hyper-competitive, production-obsessed society.
So, similar feeling, different name.
Pretty much, it's a local parallel to quiet quitting, reflecting that same urge to opt out of the relentless grind, the crazy pressure. But it's honestly framed within China's specific context. Things like the 996 work culture being a big factor there.
What's 996 again?
9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. Intense.
Wow, okay. So whether it's called quiet quitting here or Balin there, this core idea of stepping back from overwhelming expectations seems to be resonating globally, especially among younger people.
Exactly. It seems to cross cultures, but it definitely gets associated more strongly with the younger demographic.
Which leads us right to the next big question. Why? Why does Gen Z seem to be embracing this, or at least talking about it so much, more than other generations? Is it just a Gen Z thing?
Well, the sources suggest it's not exclusively Gen Z, but they're definitely at the forefront. The pandemic, for sure, made everyone rethink work-life balance. Burnout became a huge topic across the board. We saw reports like from PwC showing lots of people of all ages were thinking about quitting.
Right, it wasn't just young people feeling it.
Not at all. But Gen Z seems particularly receptive, particularly willing to actually do something about it, or at least talk openly about things like quiet quitting.
And why might that be? What's unique about their situation?
A big part is just timing and experience. Think about it. Their transition into adulthood, their early career years, it happened right alongside the huge disruption of COVID-19.
Yeah, that must have had a massive impact.
Huge. The source points out their experience of the pandemic was overwhelmingly negative. It hit them hard, personally and professionally. They were just entering the workforce, or maybe only a year or two in, when suddenly they're facing career disruptions, layoffs that often hit entry-level jobs hardest, hiring freezes. Plus the general stress and impact on mental well-being during those really formative years.
So their whole introduction to the working world was shaped by crisis and uncertainty, maybe more than older generations experienced at that stage.
That seems to be a really significant factor, yes. Their initial taste of professional life was just tough. And you combine that difficult entry with what the sources describe as their maybe inherently different approach to work anyway.
Different how?
Well, the sources consistently highlight that Gen Z tends to place a really high value on work-life balance right from the start. They're often described as rejecting intense competition, especially if it feels pointless or doesn't lead anywhere tangible. They seem to desire a more relaxed lifestyle, or at least one where work doesn't dominate everything.
So it's not necessarily anti-work, but maybe anti that all-consuming work lifestyle.
That's a great way to put it. And they seem less afraid to actively look for companies that match those preferences for balance and well-being, or to disengage if the job doesn't meet those needs.
Is there data to back that up?
Yeah, the Deloitte survey cited in one article really nails this. For both Gen Z and millennials, who share some similarities here, good work-life balance, opportunities for learning and development, those were the absolute top priorities when looking at employers. Salary matters, obviously, but balance and growth actually ranked higher for them.
And the burnout figures for Gen Z are quite striking too, aren't they?
They really are. That same Deloitte survey found 45%. Almost half of Gen Z felt burned out, specifically because of their work environment. And almost the same number, 44%, said they'd actually left jobs in the past because the workload pressure was too much.
That's huge. That's people actively quitting because of pressure.
Exactly. It's not just feeling a bit tired, it's making major life choices based on unsustainable workloads.
And they seem less worried about leaving without something else lined up.
That's another key point from the survey. A big chunk, 40%, plan to leave their current job within 2 years. And maybe the most telling statistic, 35% were willing to leave without another job secured.
Wow. That really suggests a different mindset, doesn't it?
It does. Maybe a different risk tolerance, or maybe just a stronger commitment to their immediate well-being, their mental health, their personal time, over traditional ideas of career security, or always having that next step planned.
Now, we should acknowledge the other side. One article quotes Kathy Akrotopoulos, who makes a fair point. Quiet quitting might give you that short-term relief, but it could hurt you in the long run, right? Things like bonuses, promotions.
Absolutely. That's the traditional view, isn't it? Career progression often relies on showing you can go beyond the minimum. If you're deliberately only doing the basics, you might not be seen as ready for more responsibility or higher rewards within that conventional structure.
But it sounds like many in Gen Z are aware of that trade-off and maybe choosing differently.
It seems that way. The anecdotes and survey data suggest they might be prioritizing other things like their health, their time, their sanity more highly than rapid career advancement or bigger paychecks, especially if those come at a significant personal cost.
Like Rebecca's story in the article.
Exactly. Rebecca, the 24-year-old,
Yeah.
they quote, she's a perfect example. She explicitly decided, okay, I'm only doing what's in my job description, after getting burned out from overworking initially. For her, protecting her health and free time was a conscious choice, more important than whatever the company might demand beyond her core duties.
And she wasn't just coasting, she had a plan.
Right. She mentioned seeing her current job partly as a resume builder for something else, something that aligns better with her values. She specifically mentioned wanting to work on environmental impact, and her saying she'd quit without another job. That lines up perfectly with the survey data.
It really paints a picture of my well-being and values come first, and I won't sacrifice them for a job that doesn't get that, especially if the reward isn't clear.
That sentiment comes through really strongly. And Zaid Khan, the TikTok guy, he said something similar. Your worth as a person is not defined by your labor. And he added that crucial point. We're realizing that our overworking, we don't see that leading us down the same fruitful path as it did for older generations.
Ugh, that fruitful path idea. That feels really key, especially when you think about the economic reality for young people now, like housing costs in China, youth unemployment. Those are huge pressures.
This is absolutely critical for understanding the Balin movement and its link to quiet quitting among Chinese Gen Z. The article talks about the intense 996 culture, right? Working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Yeah, insane hours.
But here's the thing. Despite putting in those crazy hours, sometimes for years, many young people in China are finding that the traditional rewards, that fruitful path, affording a home, the huge cost of raising kids, moving up the ladder in a way that really changes your life compared to your parents, it just seems out of reach.
So the promise isn't holding up.
It seems less certain. Anyway, the implicit deal: work incredibly hard, sacrifice everything, and you'll definitely get ahead financially and socially. That might have worked for some older generations, but it feels broken or just unattainable for many young people today.
So if you don't believe you'll actually get the big payoff for all that intense overwork, why would you do it? Why make that massive sacrifice?
That seems to be a core driver behind Balin and quiet quitting in that context. The sources suggest this disillusionment fuels the willingness to disengage. If Gen Z feels the return on investment for relentless hustle just isn't there, they're less likely to buy into it, maybe less afraid to set boundaries or just quietly step back. They don't see that traditional fruitful path automatically appearing just because they work themselves to the bone.
And their sheer numbers in the workforce must give them some leverage, too, even if it's not organized.
Yeah, demographics definitely play a part in this potential power shift. Gen Z is flooding into the workforce. They're projected to be around 30% of it by 2030. That's huge. You add that to boomers retiring, Gen X moving up, and the whole makeup of the workforce changes. Even if the job market fluctuates, their growing presence matters. As Joe Galvin from Vistage pointed out in one piece, things that millennials and Gen Z used to maybe ask for before the pandemic, like flexibility, better balance now, feel more like demands. They have more leverage, maybe feel more empowered to walk away or disengage if things aren't right.
So it's this mix, a generation shaped by crisis and economic pressure, with different core values, entering the workforce in large numbers and pushing back against old norms.
That sums it up really well. It's complex generational values, economic realities, specific cultural stuff like in China, and the ongoing fallout from the pandemic. And to really get under the hood, to understand the mechanisms linking these pressures to the act of quiet quitting, that's where the detailed academic study from China is so valuable.
Okay, yeah, let's really dig into that study now. You mentioned it used social exchange theory, or SET, to look at Chinese Gen Z. Can you break down what SET means in this work context?
Sure. Social exchange theory, at its core, is about relationships being based on perceived costs and benefits. In the workplace, SET sees the employee-organization relationship as this kind of exchange. Employees give their time, skills, energy, commitment, that's their input, their cost.
And the organization gives.
Pay, benefits, job security, training, support, recognition, maybe promotion opportunities. Those are the benefits the employee receives.
So we're all kind of subconsciously keeping score.
Yes, the basic idea, yeah. The theory suggests employees are always evaluating if this exchange feels fair, if it's reciprocal. When you feel it's balanced, you feel valued, rewarded appropriately, the company's holding up its end, you're more likely to feel positive, committed, maybe even willing to go the extra mile.
But if it feels unbalanced,
That's when things shift. If you feel the costs, like high stress, crazy hours, no support, feeling unrecognized, are way higher than the benefits you're getting, that perceived imbalance can lead to negative feelings, less commitment, less engagement. Like feeling the company genuinely supports you. That's a benefit that, according to SET, should make you want to reciprocate with positive behaviors.
okay. So the study used this ESET lens to pinpoint specific workplace things that might feel like a bad deal to young workers, potentially pushing them towards quiet quitting.
Exactly. They looked at 5 key organizational conditions,
Mm-hmm.
different parts of that employee-organization exchange. They were, first, work conditions, basically, the overall environment, workload, stress, safety, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Second, job security, how stable you feel your job is. Third, perceived career development opportunities. Do you see a path forward? Training, learning, promotions.
Makes sense.
Fourth, effective organizational commitment. This is more emotional. Do you feel connected to the company? Do you identify with it? Do you want to stay?
Right. The emotional bond.
And fifth, perceived organizational support, basically. Do you believe the company actually values you and cares about your well-being?
So 5 key areas. And how did the study find these relate to quiet quitting? Was it a direct link?
This is where it gets really interesting and adds some nuance. The study found these 5 factors don't necessarily have a simple, direct impact on quiet quitting intention. Instead, their influence is mostly indirect. They operate through 2 crucial mediating factors.
Mediating factors,
Well-
like steps in between?
Exactly. Think of them as the middlemen, the critical links in the chain reaction. The 5 organizational conditions affect these mediators, and then those mediators directly influence whether a Gen Z employee intends to quietly quit.
And what were these 2 mediators?
They were job burnout and employee well-being.
Ah, okay. So the workplace conditions affect how burned out you feel and how good you feel generally, and that's the immediate trigger for quiet quitting.
That's precisely the pathway they uncovered. Let's break down the links they found. First, how the conditions affected burnout and well-being. They found poor work conditions, high workload, stress, bad environment, significantly increased job burnout, and significantly decreased employee well-being. No huge surprise there.
Right.
Low job security, feeling your job's on the line, also increased job burnout and decreased employee well-being.
Also makes sense. Worrying about your job is stressful.
Definitely. Limited perceived career development opportunities, feeling stuck, no growth again, increased job burnout, and decreased employee well-being.
Feeling like you're going nowhere.
Exactly. Low effective organizational commitment, that lack of emotional connection, also led to increased job burnout and decreased employee well-being.
If you don't care, it's probably easier to get worn down.
Seems plausible. And finally, low perceived organizational support, feeling the company doesn't value or care about you, predictably increased job burnout and decreased employee well-being.
So basically, bad conditions across the board lead to more burnout and lower well-being for these young workers. That feels pretty intuitive.
It does align with what we generally understand about workplace stress. Now, the next step, how did burnout and well-being then directly influence quiet quitting intention? The study found higher levels of job burnout significantly increase the intention to quietly quit. That's a strong link. The more burned out you feel, the more likely you are to pull back.
Okay.
Conversely, higher levels of employee well-being significantly decrease the intention to quietly quit. If you're feeling good, balanced, healthy, you're less likely to check out.
So well-being acts as a buffer.
Exactly. And there was one more factor they found had a direct impact on quiet quitting, kind of bypassing the burnout well-being route. Perceived psychological contract violation.
Psychological contract violation. We touched on that. What does that mean in practice? What does it feel like for an employee?
Right. So the psychological contract isn't written down. It's not your employment contract. It's all the unwritten expectations, the mutual obligations, the promises sometimes explicit, sometimes just implied, that build up between you and your employer.
Like during the hiring process or things your manager says?
Exactly. Or just the general company culture. A perceived psychological contract violation happens when you feel the organization has broken one of those promises or hasn't held up its end of the unspoken deal.
So like you were told there'd be training opportunities, but they never happen. Or promised a promotion for hitting targets, but it doesn't materialize.
Perfect examples. It's that feeling of being let down, maybe even deceived, feeling your efforts weren't recognized the way you were led to believe they would be. It's a breach of trust. And the study found that simply feeling this violation directly increases Gen Z's intention to quietly quit. It hits that trust and commitment straight away.
Okay, so putting it all together, bad workplace conditions fuel burnout and lower your well-being. Those feelings then push you towards quiet quitting. And separately, feeling like the company broke its promises also directly pushes you that way.
That's the core structure. Now, the really critical finding about the mediation is how it confirms the pathway. The study specifically showed that Joe burnout mediates the link, meaning things like bad conditions, low security, no growth, weak connection, poor support lead to more burnout. And it's because of that burnout that employees are more likely to quietly quit. Burnout is the key stepping stone.
Ah, I get it. So it's not just bad conditions, quiet quitting. It's bad conditions, burnout, and then burnout, quiet quitting.
Precisely. The burnout state itself, that emotional, physical exhaustion, makes doing anything extra feel impossible or just not worth it. Quiet quitting becomes a way to cope, to preserve what little energy you have left.
And well-being mediates the other way. Good conditions lead to well-being, which leads to less quiet quitting.
Exactly right. The study also confirmed that employee well-being mediates the relationship. When those 5 organizational factors are positive, good conditions, security, growth opportunities, strong connection, great support, they lead to higher well-being. And it's because well-being is higher that the intention to quietly quit goes down. Feeling good about your work life makes you less likely to withdraw.
That's a really significant finding. It tells organizations they can't just focus on, say, performance reviews. They have to tackle the things causing burnout and hurting well-being, because that's the direct link to engagement, or lack thereof.
Absolutely. It empirically backs up the idea that well-being and engagement are deeply intertwined, and both are hugely influenced by the work environment and how fair that social exchange feels.
Now, the study also looked for something called a moderating effect, right? And didn't find it. They tested if feeling that psychological contract violation made the burnout or low well-being worse in terms of leading to quiet quitting.
That's right, and it's a really interesting nuance, possibly specific to this group. They tested if feeling betrayed by the company, the psychological contract violation, would amplify the effect of burnout or low well-being on quiet quitting. You might logically expect that, right? If you're burned out and you feel the company screwed you over, maybe that pushes you even harder towards disengagement.
Yeah, you'd think it would pour fuel on the fire.
Exactly. But for this sample of Chinese Gen Z, they didn't find significant evidence of that. Psychological contract violation didn't seem to make the burnout quiet quitting link stronger, nor did it make the low well-being quiet quitting link stronger.
Huh. So feeling betrayed still pushes them to quiet quit directly.
Yes, that direct link was still significant.
But it doesn't necessarily interact with the burnout or well-being pathway to make those effects even more powerful.
That's what this specific study found. Now, the authors offered some speculation on why this might be, especially for Gen Z in China. They suggested that maybe because this generation might have shorter job tenures on average, or maybe lower emotional attachment or expectations of lifelong loyalty to one company. Maybe they don't experience that psychological contract violation as this incredibly deep personal betrayal in the same way older generations might have.
So it's bad, it makes them want to check out, but it's not necessarily the final straw that makes burnout unbearable.
Kind of, it's still a negative factor that directly increases quiet quitting intention. But in this study, it didn't seem to intensify the negative impact of already being burned out or having low well-being. The authors floated the idea that maybe their view is more transactional. If the deal is broken, okay, that's a reason to disengage or leave, but perhaps not a reason for deep emotional wounding that exacerbates burnout. It's more about an immediate imbalance than a broken long-term bond. Again, just speculation by the authors, but it hints at potential generational differences in how these things are processed.
That's fascinating. It suggests maybe Gen Z has different expectations around loyalty and different reactions when things go wrong.
It certainly points that way. Understanding that psychological contract might need some recalibration for this generation.
Okay, so let's pull this together. We have the study showing quiet quitting is driven by burnout and low well-being, which stem from these core workplace conditions and support issues, plus the direct impact of feeling promises were broken. And we have the broader context of Gen Z values, the economy, the pandemic. What does this all mean for organizations? What should they actually do?
Well, the biggest takeaway, loud and clear from this study, is that organizations can't fix quiet quitting by just demanding more effort or trying to guilt people back into hustle mode. They have to address the root causes.
Mm.
The study identified those environmental factors that crank up burnout, crush well-being, and make employees feel the exchange is unfair or promises are broken.
It's about fixing the system, not just blaming the employee.
Exactly. The study points to several key areas for action. First, they need to enhance work conditions. And that's more than just comfy chairs. It means really looking at workload, managing stress, ensuring safety, physical and psychological, and providing clarity. The study even suggested practical things like structured open days for new hires.
Open days, how's that different from standard onboarding?
The idea is to dedicate specific time early on to reduce anxiety and uncertainty. So it may be detailed sessions on company culture, clear explanations of roles, introducing support systems, creating safe spaces for questions. It's about proactively addressing concerns, making expectations clear, providing resources up front to reduce that early stress that can feed into burnout later.
Proactive support right from the beginning. Got it. What about career growth? That came up a lot.
Absolutely critical for Gen Z. The study linked limited opportunities to burnout. So organizations need to actively provide perceived career development opportunities. Gen Z values learning. They can get bored if things feel stagnant. This could mean formal job rotation programs, trying to align tasks with interest, offering challenging projects, and importantly, providing realistic job previews during hiring.
Realistic previews. You mean don't oversell the job?
Pretty much. Be honest about the challenges and the real opportunities. It sets accurate expectations, reduces the chance of feeling that psychological contract was violated later when reality doesn't match the hype. And managers are key here. They need to be having regular conversations about goals, looking for ways to help people develop skills.
So managers need to be more like coaches.
Yes, definitely. It takes intentional effort. And connected to that is culture and support. Organizations need to actively foster a supportive organizational culture and increase effective commitment. Remember how low emotional connection linked to burnout? This means building a genuinely cooperative, empathetic environment. People need to feel supported by colleagues and leaders, offering things like mental health resources, EAPs, and ensuring fairness in all management practices helps build that trust and emotional bond.
And that feeling of being valued ties right into perceived organizational support.
It does. Organizations have to improve perceived organizational support. Employees need to genuinely believe the company values their contributions and cares about their well-being, not just their output. Managers are on the front line here, providing support, acknowledging contributions, big and small, creating a positive day-to-day vibe. And drawing from that social exchange theory, the study highlights offering appropriate rewards, both material, like fair pay and clear promotion paths, and non-material, like recognition, praise, interesting assignments. The exchange needs to feel equitable.
So fair pay plus feeling seen and appreciated.
That's the combination. And crucially, organizations need to support managers to do all this. Managers can't do it alone. They need training, tools, data to spot engagement issues early. They need support in developing skills like empathy and building real connections with their teams.
And thinking about Rebecca wanting work with environmental impact, does purpose fit in here?
That's a great point. Why purpose wasn't one of the core 5 factors in the study's model, it's clearly relevant, especially given Gen Z's values. Low effective commitment was linked to burnout and quiet quitting. Connecting work to a larger purpose, showing how tasks make a difference, can definitely boost motivation and that emotional connection. So organizations should absolutely think about how to effectively address purpose and communicate the impact of the work.
It adds another dimension to that exchange, meaning not just money and support.
Exactly. It can make the relationship feel less transactional. And finally, underpinning all this, organizations need to regularly check the pulse. Don't wait for quiet quitting to become a crisis. Use surveys, check-ins, feedback loops, whatever works to understand how people are really feeling, track engagement, spot burnout risks early. Proactive intervention is key.
It really sounds like tackling quiet quitting means fundamentally rethinking the employee experience around well-being, support, and growth, not just focusing on output.
It really does. The study makes a strong case that quiet quitting is mostly a symptom, a response to the environment and the employee's state. Burnout, low well-being, feeling let down. Fixing the underlying conditions is the only sustainable way to foster real engagement.
Okay, before we wrap up, one article mentioned boomerang hiring. How does that fit into this quiet quitting picture?
Yeah, that's an interesting connection. Boomerang hiring is when employees leave, work somewhere else, and then come back to their old company later. The source suggested that with Gen Z, their willingness to explore, maybe even quiet quit if things aren't right, could actually feed into this trend.
How so? They leave because they're disengaged?
Right. They might leave or quiet quit for a while, then leave because
Hmm.
the conditions aren't right then. Maybe they need better balance, want to try a different field, pursue a passion. But, and this is the key, if they leave without, burning the place down, perhaps because they quietly disengaged rather than having a big conflict,
Hmm.
and if their priorities change later, or maybe the company makes significant improvements to those very conditions that push them away, they might actually be open to returning.
So their tendency to move around, even quiet quit, doesn't necessarily mean they're gone forever. The door might stay open if things change.
It suggests that possibility, yeah. This idea of exploration without burning bridges. They might not offer decades of loyalty, but they might boomerang back if the role or the company evolves to meet their needs better down the line. It makes boomerang hiring potentially more relevant for companies trying to get talent back if they've addressed the issues.
That adds another layer, doesn't it? Thinking about talent flow as potentially cyclical.
It reflects a more fluid approach to careers, for sure.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these threads together from our deep dive. Quiet quitting, it's clearly more than just a buzzword. It's a real thing, seems particularly relevant for Gen Z, representing this conscious pullback, setting boundaries, often driven by feeling overwhelmed, unsupported, or maybe disillusioned with the old work hard, get ahead promise.
And that detailed study from China really gives us the mechanics. It shows powerfully that this isn't just random laziness. It's strongly linked to concrete workplace conditions, poor environment, insecurity, lack of growth, weak emotional ties, feeling unsupported. These things fuel job burnout and crush employee well-being.
And it's those states, burnout and low well-being, that are the key pathways leading directly to quiet quitting.
Yeah.
Plus, that direct hit from feeling the psychological contract was violated.
Exactly. And the message for organizations seems crystal clear. If you want to engage and keep Gen Z talent, you have to look inward. You have to fix the fundamental issues, the root causes that create environments where people feel the need to check out just to survive or protect themselves. It boils down to building workplaces that prioritize well-being and offer a fair, supportive exchange.
This whole conversation really highlights how tightly linked employee experience, mental health, and basic work conditions are to actual engagement and performance.
They're absolutely foundational. Expecting constant high effort or intrinsic motivation without addressing those basics, especially from a generation with different priorities and experiences,
Yeah.
well, it's just not realistic.
It definitely leaves us with a big question, maybe a provocative thought for everyone listening. If doing just your job, sticking to the description, the hours becomes the new baseline, or at least a common strategy for a big part of the workforce, what does that really mean for our traditional ideas about climbing the ladder based on going the extra mile? What does it mean for company loyalty, for the whole employer-employee relationship as we've known it? Or is it maybe just resetting expectations to a healthier, more sustainable level for everyone? And if that's the case, how do employers then genuinely inspire effort beyond that baseline, if not through the old pressures?
That is the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? How do organizations adapt? How do they attract and motivate a workforce that clearly prioritizes balance and well-being? How do you foster discretionary effort that comes from genuine value, trust, and maybe shared purpose, rather than just obligation or fear?
Definitely a lot to think about there for anyone in the world of work. Thanks so much for walking us through all the layers of quiet quitting today.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating topic once you get past the headlines.
And thank you for listening to the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another stack of sources to explore.